All right, all right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Monroe, Louisiana. And shout out to Yunu for jumping in the chat. He said, "What's up?" And what's up to you, Yunu. Today is January 18th, 2025. It's about 2:02 a.m. where I'm at right now. I planned on going live earlier at around 11:45 p.m. yesterday, but I was out with my good friend that I hadn't seen in about I don't even know, man, close to a decade. So I was out with Acti, my friend, and we got to explore the city, see new spots. I'll post up the videos of my adventures tonight, hopefully on the channel sometime soon, and y'all can get to enjoy it with me. And once again, apologies to anybody who's been waiting for me to go live, or people that count on me or look forward to me going live and doing these book react series. So yeah, shout out to everybody out there who's tuning in, and let's jump into it. I'm a bit lit, by the way. I'm a bit tipsy. I'm a bit lit because we were out partying and stuff like that. So if I slur my speech or if I mess up on anything, then forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. Anyway, we're reading White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th-Century South, written by Martha Hodes. You can pick up this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $28. Only $28 hardcover. The Amazon link is not hard to find. It's in the first video. And yeah, we're going to be starting part 2 and jumping into chapter 6, Wartime, New Voices and New Dangers. Part 2 of this book talks about escalating violence. The previous sections that we've read so far in this book talk about how before the end of slavery, it was still rare, but not totally unheard of for white women to sleep with black men and either have children with them, have their divorces refused even after they were caught cheating with black men, and also sometimes even willingly marrying black men during a time when that was highly taboo and very illegal. So the reason for reading this book is to shed light on a part of Southern history and the American history of slavery, to sort of show that, what we think of as being the truth or what we think of as being real is not exactly what it always was. Like, we tend to think black men caught with a white woman in the bed, that brother is automatically going to get lynched, right? But that wasn't always the case. The previous chapter we read was about this guy named Joseph Nunez, who was a man of questionable ancestry. Some people believed he was colored. Some people thought he was Indian. Some people believed he was white, a free white man. And he was in trouble for selling slaves. He was in trouble for selling slaves, and they refused the sale of his slaves because they believed he was a black man, and black men are not allowed to, engage in that sort of business. A white man was caught doing the same thing generally and was allowed to do it, right? Because he was a white man, even though some people question his ancestry. That's generally what I remember from chapter 5. I suggest watching the previous live stream. Anyway, we're going to be jumping into chapter 6. And once again, if anybody has any comments, they will be read in the live stream. So I'm looking forward to hearing what y'all got to say. Let me make sure that I'm able to see your comments by turning down the battery power. Hold on, wait, let me take it off low power mode. Okay. So that way it stays on and I can read any of your comments. So let's go into it. Chapter 6, Wartime, New Voices and New Dangers. The 4 years of upheaval that the Civil War brought to Southern communities also brought significant changes in the meaning of sexual liaisons between black men and white women. Accordingly, the focus must shift from the outbreak of the war forward. The consequences of such liaisons would no longer play out solely as community dramas of gossip, disapproval, and anguish. With Black freedom came new fears and brutalities on the part of white people, and local stories concerning practical life in small communities now fade in favor of larger social and political chronicles. Sex between Black men and white women now became a frequent and direct topic in the arena of national politics. Indeed, the invention of the word miscegenation in 1864 was the strategy of one political party against another. At the same time, wartime documents shed new light on the dynamics of sexual liaisons between Black men and white women as they had come to pass under slavery. For during the war, the voices of Black men emerged for the first time. Recall when a white community in the antebellum South confronted a sexual liaison between a black man and a white woman. The man rarely had a chance to tell his story for the historical record. The voices of Southern white men have been most clearly audible in the stories of sex between black men and white women thus far recounted. Documents offer the versions of local authorities like Jesse Hargrave, the county magistrate who wrote up a bastardy warrant for Polly Lane, of well-to-do slave owners like Edmund's master, John Richardson, who protected his slave, of professionals like Dr. Dudley W. Hammond, who lectured on the science of racial categorization. The voices of white men of lesser standing have also been perceptible, struggling farmers like Lewis Bourne or poorer men like Polly Lane's father, who refused to divulge his daughter's whereabouts. Voices of transgressing white women have also come through, often, though not always, mediated through someone else's story. There is Nell Butler's retort to Lord Baltimore, Polly Lane's testimony on the witness stand, and Doretha Bourne's petition of grievance. There are also white women's versions of other people's transgressions. Those who recounted the wedding of Nell and Charles, neighborhood women who guessed at the race of Polly's baby, the midwife who defended Doretha Bourne, the women who claimed to have danced on the same floor as James Nunes, and those who offered opinions on Franklin Hughley's racial status. By contrast, by the way, Franklin Hughley, now it's coming back to me. So, yeah, the last chapter we read, in chapter 5, the Nunes guy, colored man or possibly a Native American or a white man with African ancestry, was refused the opportunity to sell his slaves. And that was right before the end of the Civil War. Oh, sorry. Yeah, right before the end of the Civil War in Georgia. Franklin Hughley was a dead baby. He died at 7 years old, right? And his father, I believe, wanted a divorce from his wife, and he was claiming that his wife had cheated on him with a black man, and the son that died actually was Negro, right? So something like that. That's what chapter 5 was about. Anyway, continuing here. By contrast, white people attributed only 2 words to Charles in their recollections, that he referred to Nell as his old woman. Jim's lawyers referred to the story which the Negro told us, though only fragments of that story were recorded. Edmund's voice was recorded only in the master story that the slave had tried to forsake the white woman, and in the story that Edmund agreed provisionally to provide for one of the children. White people who recounted the story of James Nunes did not attribute one word or thought to this black man. And although Amos Hughley once confided in a neighbor that a black man slept in his house when he was absent, that man was never again mentioned, let alone named, nor were any words or thoughts attributed to him. Only the actions and words of a few black men have allowed a glimpse of defiance on the subject of sex with white women in the antebellum South. Recall the slave Delks Moses, who eluded authorities in Virginia by violently threatening white people and living with a white woman. Recall the slave George, who assaulted and murdered a white man in North Carolina, and the free Redding Evans of Georgia, who taunted and murdered a white man. In contrast to all that has come before, then the middle of the Civil War brought a moment in which the voices of black men were set on record, not in county archives, but in the chronicles of the national government. The tellers were mostly white men who had spoken with black men, and thus the voices remained mediated through those who held greater power. At the same time, because black men were the original storytellers, the voices of the transgressing white women are, for once, mediated through those of their male partners. And in some instances, black men did speak directly on the subject of sex with white women. Wartime stories. I will tell you a fact that I have never seen alluded to publicly, and I suppose a man would be scouted who should allude to it publicly, stated Captain Richard Hinton. But my relations with the colored people have led me to believe that there is a large amount of intercourse between white women and colored men. So Captain Hinton, an ardent white abolitionist who commanded black troops during the Civil War, testified in 18 before the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, which had been formed under the War Department to foster the incorporation of emancipated slaves into American society. The AFIC, composed of 3 white anti-slavery men, would ultimately propose the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau to assist former slaves in their transition to free labor. Although the word intercourse was often used in the 19th century to mean conversation or interaction, Hinton's later testimony makes it particular meaning clear. makes his particular meaning clear. And Hinton was not the only witness to retell the stories of Black men on the subject of sex with white women. The indexer for the Wartime Commission saw fit to make entries under the letter I for illicit intercourse between white women and Black men not uncommon, and intercourse between white women and colored men common, instances of. By the way, I shouldn't laugh because, even though we traditionally think men as more dominant than women in the system of slavery, everything is put on its head, and many of these Black men could have been considered, sexually assaulted by these white women who had more power than them. Continuing here. James Redpath, another white abolitionist and a self-described revolutionary, had traveled through the South during the 1850s to talk with Black residents. Testifying before the AFIC, Redpath first elaborated on the depravity of white men who sexually exploited slave women, which prompted one commissioner to ask, "Well, sir, among such a universal system of liberty effect upon white women," speaking of his Black informants, Redpath answered, "I have often heard them talking and laughing about the numerous cases that have occurred in which white women have had colored children." One Black man told Redpath that it was just as common for colored men to have connection with white women as for white men to have to do with colored women. Another said that it was an extremely common thing among all the handsome mulattoes at the South to have connection with the white women. Redpath relayed an episode told to him by a Black man about a white woman of good family in Mobile, Alabama, who carried on an affair with a slave, had sex with him on the morning of her wedding, and bore his child 9 months later. Redpath concluded, "There is a great deal more of this than the public suspect." Another white man, Samuel B. Lucille, who had lived for 2 years on a cotton plantation near Natchez, Mississippi, likewise told the Wartime Commission that the cross between woman and a Black man was not uncommon, adding, "I knew well a ferryman on the Wachita River whose mother was a white woman and his father a Black man. He was a free voter, but it was notorious in the neighborhood that he was a half-blooded Negro," likely giving a more accurate perspective to the question of frequency. A freedman named J.W. Lindsay, who had lived in Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, told the commission, "There are very few mulattoes that come from pure white women, though I have known some cases of that kind." The testimony of Major George L. Stearns, a white abolitionist who led recruitment efforts for Black Union soldiers throughout the North before he organized Black troops out of Nashville, told the commissioners, "I have often been amused that the planters here in Tennessee have sometimes to watch their daughters to keep them from intercourse with the Negroes. This, though, of course, exceptional, is yet common enough to be a source of uneasiness to parents." The rarity of such information becomes apparent in the trajectory of James Redpath's testimony. Although Redpath told the commission about sexual liaisons between Black men and white women in considerable detail, he had withheld such knowledge from the public just a few significant years earlier. In a collection of his dispatches from the South, published in 1859, Redpath most solemnly declared that in no one instance have I sought either to darken or embellish the truth, to add to, subtract from, or pervert a single statement of the slaves. Yet with one brief exception, Redpath had in fact omitted information about sexual liaisons between Black men and white women from the book, instead extolling the chastity of Southern white women and sympathizing with them for the immoral conduct of their white husbands, fathers, and brothers. Perhaps Redpath had understood, along with his publisher, how dangerous to the cause of abolition would be any disclosure of sex between Black men and white women in the volatile years before the outbreak of war. 4 years later, Redpath, Richard Hinton, and a few others seized on the wartime juncture of social and political upheaval to quote the stories they had heard from Black men, and some Black men themselves spoke publicly about white women and sex. As it turned out, the officers of the AFIC suppressed all of these stories. Only in the brief interval of wartime disruption were the voices of Black men given credence in a public arena. Significant notes of defiance can be detected in the voices of the Black men recorded by white abolitionists during the war. The wartime testimony before the AFIC offers a glimpse of well-guarded circles of Black men, both free and slave, as one setting in which they could speak boldly about sex with white women. Listen to Patrick H. Minor, a Black man who had worked as a steward on the Mississippi River. Minor, later a commissioned officer in the war, told Hinton that Black men who worked on the river shared information among themselves about the desires of certain white women to sleep with them. Recall James Redpath's words about his Black informants. I have often heard them talking and laughing about the numerous cases that have occurred in which white women have had colored children. Even if Hinton and Redpath were embellishing their stories, there is no reason to doubt that Black men traded information and laughed together about the scorning of social and legal injunctions. If Black men who had sex with white women or who speculated on that possibility bragged among themselves, the wartime dialogues also reveal evidence of stern disapproval within their own communities. The sentiments of a Black man who had fled the South for Canada were likely shared by others. The town's white mayor reported to the Wartime Commission. A colored man ran away with a white girl, and a colored man, speaking of the affair, said, I always looked upon him as a respectable man. I didn't think he would fall so low as to marry a white girl. Indeed, the wartime testimony illuminates ideas within Black communities about the depravity of all white women. Unlike white Southerners, Black Southerners did not necessarily make distinctions of virtue based on class. Even approval on the parts of Black communities indicates suspicions about the decency of any white woman. A Black Methodist bishop who had also left the South for Canada told the commissioners that when a Black man and a white woman got married, if the man is an upright man and the woman an upright woman, they treat them as if they were both colored. This man also mentioned two Black men, a grocery keeper and a house plasterer, both married to white women. Those women, he said, as much respect as any Black woman. Perhaps not surprisingly, in the AFIC report incorporating this testimony, Commissioner Samuel Gridley Howe altered this, whether unwittingly or not, to read that the wives were as much respected as any white woman. Other Black refugees from the South to Canada offered similar opinions about relationships with white women while talking to the government. In 1863, a barber named John Kinney commented, I want to have a woman I am not ashamed to go into the street or into company with, and that people won't make remarks about. A white teacher named Mr. Sinclair similarly recalled, quite a noise was made about the marriage of a Black man to a white woman about 4 years ago, and the Blacks seemed as much displeased as the whites. Susan Boggs, who had escaped from slavery in Virginia and may have been the only woman to speak to the commission on this subject, recounted, my son married a white woman, not that his marrying a white woman made it any better for me. I have to say this. I think, some Black people at that time, or maybe the majority, by the way she's framing it, probably thought that, a lot of white women might be depraved, because we have to remember that the white women that were sleeping with some Black men in the South before the end of slavery or during the Civil War and stuff like that, these were not mostly, the planter class women, the upper class, the bourgeoisie. These were mostly the working white poor. And so they looked down on them just as much, as maybe the white slave owners look down on slaves, right? Secondly, I think, some Black people were thinking, like, let's not agitate the whites. Let's not make them get so upset by thinking that our men want to sleep with their women. So that might be also a part of it as well. The voices of the Black men in this wartime testimony also offer a narrative about sex with white women heretofore unilluminated. Along with registering a measure of defiance on the part of the men, the wartime narratives also reveal the possibility of sexual coercion by white women and the dangers of resistance, especially for a Black man who had sex with a white woman for the planter classes. The accounts of Black men recorded in the wartime testimony, moreover, include information about illicit liaisons with planters' daughters or plantation mistresses, information rarely, if ever, recorded in detail before the war. Black men told Richard Hinton in no uncertain terms that some white women in the South sought out sex with them. Hinton recounted a conversation he had with the Black steamboat steward Patrick Minor, who informed Hinton of the women of a particular white family. According to Minor, the colored men on that river knew that the women of the Ward family of Louisville, Kentucky, were in the habit of having the stewards or other fine-looking fellows sleep with them when they were on the boats. Minor also relayed a personal anecdote about a Ward woman who, when on Minor's boat, had offered him $5 to arrive at her house in Louisville at a particular time. Minor waited for the woman until he had to return to work, and although the rendezvous never took place, the black man had no doubt that she wanted him to have connection with her. James Redpath heard similar stories. One black informant, pressed on how liaisons with the white woman came to pass, said, "I will tell you how it is here. I will go up with the towels, and when I go into the room, the woman will keep following me with her eyes until I take notice of it, and one thing leads to another. Others take hold of me and pull me on the sofa, and others will stick out their foot and ask one to tie their boot, and I will take hold of their foot and say, 'What a pretty foot.'" Thus did the black men inform their white northern listeners that a white woman from a planter family could force a black man to have sex. "I have never yet found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence I have won," Hinton testified, "who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled either by his mistress or by white women of the same class to have connection with them." So that's basically, this white guy who's working for the Freedmen's Bureau is basically saying, like, many of the house Negroes, right, the black men who are descended from, mostly African women who are, sexually abused by the slave master, right? A lot of these, very light-skinned men have all said that they were sexually assaulted by their white owners, the females, right? And this is actually horrible. I know it might be funny just to laugh at because it sounds so, outlandish how we think about history. But when we really sit back and think about it, this is grape, as they say on YouTube. Grape, RAP, if you know what I mean. Hinton also recounted a conversation with a white Kansas doctor who knew his experience in Virginia and Missouri that a very large number of white women, especially the daughters of the smaller planters who were brought into more direct relations with the Negro, had compelled some of the men to have something to do with them. A former slave likewise told Hinton about his experience with his 40-year-old widowed mistress. The man, who had been brought up in the family, said that he had never had anything to do with his mistress until after her husband died, but that almost a year into her widowhood, the woman ordered him to sleep with her, and he did regularly. It is imperative to approach the wartime testimony of white abolitionists recounting the stories told by black men with caution. White Northern ideas about race, gender, and sexuality were no more straightforward than white Southern ideas. Richard Hinton, for one, simultaneously invoked and contradicted the impression of black men as Hinton spoke of black men as reluctant to comply with the sexual aggressions of white women, while simultaneously holding to the idea of black male sexual ardor. When Hinton told the AFIC a story about a white woman who pressed a black man into having sex with her, one commissioner commented, "He didn't need much persuasion, did he?" Hinton answered, "I have generally found that unless the woman has treated them kindly and won their confidence, they have to be threatened, have their passions roused by actual contact, which a woman who goes as far as that would not hesitate to give." Yet elsewhere, Hinton put forth ideas about black male potency, though he never attributed violent lust to black men. For example, he concluded a story about white frontier women who wished to give loose to their passions by saying, "And I suppose, as the Negro is very strongly amative, that the gratification of passion would be greater with them than with a white man." If these Northern abolitionists passion, they also believed the white women, often without distinction of class, to be downright corrupt. The theme of profligacy among Southern white women and men of all classes was common in Northern anti-slavery thought, and whites who testified before the AFIC unmistakably drew upon this tradition. Hinton's portrayal of all Southern white women as totally licentious no doubt served his political convictions. "The complete demoralization of the South is astonishing," he told the commissioners. "I have seen white women who call themselves themselves ladies, stand on the street and call minor offenses as they were passing by sons of bitches, God damn them, and use all such phrases. And I have never been to any locality where the officers and men who were so disposed did not sleep with all the women around. Another northern white man who had spent 2 winters in the Gulf states divided the southern white population into 2 classes, slave and slave holding, commenting that females of both classes resigned themselves to folly and degradation. Of all poorer whites, he said, a more degraded, profligate, ignorant, and sinful race cannot easily be imagined. Some such pronouncements included inferences about sex between black men and white women. For example, Hinton's story about the Missouri frontier, where white settlers from North Carolina and Tennessee had accumulated wealth. The daughters in these families, he said, knew that their brothers were sleeping with the chambermaids or other servants, and I don't see how it could be otherwise than that they too should give loose to their passions. In one published report, Commissioner Howe wrote, "It is certain that the inevitable tendency of American slavery is not only to bring about promiscuous intercourse among the blacks and between black women and white men, but also to involve white women in the general depravity and to lower the standard of female purity." He continued, "The subject is repulsive, but whoever examines critically the evidence of the social conditions of the slave states sees that the vaunted superior virtue of Southern women is mere boast and sham." White Southerners entered into this national dialogue by counter-accusing Northern white women of having sex with black men, fastening particularly on those who came South to teach in the freed people's schools during the war. One Southern white Army captain wrote in 1864 about Yankee schoolmarms who philanthropically miscegenate as well as teach, noting sarcastically the prolific birth of mongrel babies by these worthy schoolmistresses. And a Southern newspaper reported shortly after the war that white abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe would open a school in Georgia for mulatto children that have been born in the South since its invasion by Yankee schoolmarms. The stories of black men who confided in white abolitionists then were filtered through white Northern ideas about sex and sexuality in the slave South, as well as through an anti-slavery and anti-South agenda that included free elaboration of white Southern depravities. Other cautions are also in order. Perhaps the white men were so surprised by what a few black men told them about sexual coercion that they repeated startling scenarios with exaggeration. Perhaps they were exaggerating their roles as white insiders among black people or as Northern insiders among Southerners. Or exaggeration may have been spurred by their own anxieties at the thought of white women desiring black men. It is also possible that the black informants themselves had recast the experience with white women in their conversations with Northern white men, crafting their narratives as stories of coercion in order to present themselves as innocent participants in such potentially dangerous transgressions. Combine this with the possibility of male boasting about illicit sexual conquest, and it is indeed difficult to decipher the various perceptions of what had to come to pass between these black men and the white women about whom they spoke. At the same time, however, the possibility that white men like Hinton and Redpath wholly invented their testimony before the AFIC, or that the black men fabricated the stories they told to white abolitionists, is contradicted by a more direct, if rarer, record of a black woman's voice. In her 1861 autobiography, fugitive slave Harriet Jacobs indicated that black women knew about white women coercing black men into sex in the antebellum South. Of Planter's Daughters, Jacobs wrote unambiguously, "They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head has bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild." Jacobs further pointed out that his white woman did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. Rather, she selected the most brutalized over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. A few antebellum legal documents also support the wartime stories about sexual coercion by white women of slave owning families. A central Kentucky court rendered a ruling in 1841, for example, that acknowledged such powers of a white woman over a black man. The woman, named Thomas Grady, cohabited with a black man named James Hogg and sometimes called James Grady. When Thomason tried to sell some of her land, when Thomason tried to sell some of her land, she was stopped by the laws of coverture on the grounds that she was married to James. Although the court found abundant proof of cohabitation apparently tolerated, it also declared that because James it also declared that because James was a slave, whom the white woman sometimes threatened to sell, that fact would alone be sufficient to repel the presumption of marriage. Instead, the court proclaimed the presumption should be that the relation between the black man slave and free white woman was that of concubinage rather than marriage. Although this reveals nothing about the relationship from the perspectives of Thomason and James, the jurists recognized that a relationship between a male slave and a female slaveholder could not embody the mutuality that marriage was meant to imply. Suspicions about the desires of elite white women even occasionally crept into the musings of Southern patriarchs. In 1858, a white Georgian wrote disdainfully of supposed northern marriages between black men and white women, adding, "Do not many of our pretty white girls even now permit illicit Negro embrace at the South? We have as many of these black devils to manage now and keep from our women as we can." Antebellum documents also support the fact that white women from poorer families could attempt to coerce black men into sexual liaisons. Recall the words of John Richardson, who thought that his slave Edmund had been disposed to forsake Doretha, which had in turn been the cause of her visiting my Negro houses and staying all night in the quarters, indicating that Edmund may not have been a completely willing partner. Those words remain elusive, yet at least one antebellum document is explicit enough to lend a good dose of credibility to the wartime stories about the coercion of black men by white women. In 1813, in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, a slave named David twice broke into the home of the white Getz family and went on violent rampages, swinging an axe, throwing rocks, and threatening to kill either Mr. Getz or his daughter, Dolly. After David's sentencing, a number of white citizens asked the governor for a pardon. Dolly and David, it seemed, had sustained a considerable intimacy for at least 3 years, for which Dolly had received a severe whipping from her father for getting company with David. One petitioner who had caught the two together more than once claimed that Dolly admitted to me that David's improper conduct arose from her persuasions, and that she had often pleaded with him to run off with her, which he, for some length of time, refused to accede to. Dolly had earnestly entreated David to go to her father and tell him they were married, and perhaps they might then be permitted to remain together. But David refused and wept, charging her with having brought him into his unpleasant situation. Economic motives certainly influenced the decision to seek a pardon. Another petitioner described David as a very likely young Negro man, perfectly sound. Still, in the end, Dolly confided the truth of the charge. Perhaps Dolly had hoped to escape with David in order to free herself from her father's violence, suggesting the possibility that a white woman who suffered at the hands of a male relative used whatever social authority she could draw upon to flee from an abusive household. To David, however, the impossibility of such an escape, as well as lack of interest in Dolly, may have turned the idea of a tryst into cruel coercion that drove him to retaliate. The wartime testimony reveals that a liaison with a planter class white woman was more dangerous for a black man, for the woman could more readily invoke images of chastity in order to allay trouble for herself. Although the sexual coercion of black men could take place among all classes of white women, the white woman's status influenced how local authorities treated the black man. Whites were more likely to blame the man if the woman belonged to an elite family. Indeed, the poorer status of women like Doretha Born and Dolly Getz to the vindication of Edmund and David, respectively. Just as dominant ideology held that black women seduced white men, it also held that poor white women could coerce black men. Even as wealthier white women held the real power of coercion, they were protected from censure by those who held authority in their communities and by dominant ideas about white female virtue. And in such equations of seduction and coercion, only seduced white men were wholly innocent. In the wartime testimony, a black Underground Railroad agent and recruiter of black Union soldiers, William D. Matthews, told Richard Hinton about another black man who relayed that a young girl got him out in the woods and told him she would declare he attempted to force her if he didn't have connection with her. Patrick Minor told Hinton several cases of the same kind. Although the class status of these particular women remains unspecified, poorer white women might not have attempted such a threat, or if they had, might have found themselves discredited and maligned. Questions about agency and consent are difficult to untangle, but black men's own accounts of their instrumentality in liaisons with elite white women offer some clues. James Redpath asked one man who had spoken of such liaisons, "Do you dare to make advances?" To which the man replied, "No, we know too much for that." Another of Redpath's informants pointed out, "If I have connection with a white girl, she knows that if she takes precautions, she is safe. For if I should tell, I should be murdered by her father, her brother, or herself." These words point to black men's fears of violent retribution should those men engage in sex with elite white women in the slave South. Redpath, in fact, told the commission that he heard of half a dozen cases in which colored men have been killed because of their intimacy with white women. Likewise, pointing to the power of white women in his discussion of Missouri frontier daughters, Richard Hinton observed, "It was a great deal safer for them to have one of these colored fellows than a white man. If a black man in the slave South complied with a white woman either willingly or against his will, that compliance would also, in some measure, have been strategic. Like Edmund, in his liaison with Doretha Bourne, the men who told their stories to Hinton and Redpath would have been neither simply victims nor simply assenting partners. Just as some black women were able to risk fending off white men, some black men who were propositioned must have also risked refusal. Yet in liaison with an elite white woman, it was not only more dangerous for a black man to consort, but also more dangerous for him to resist or refuse. The wartime stories also illuminate the problem of an elite white woman producing a child whose father was black. The black men who spoke to white abolitionists pointed out that a planter class white woman was more likely than her poorer counterparts to have access to effective birth control, indicated by the words of Redpath's informants about taking precautions. The man who had been ordered to sleep with his widowed mistress told Hinton that the woman had procured some of those French articles that are used to prevent the consequences of sexual intercourse, a reference to condoms. Another man told Redpath that white women of better off families and black men had sex because the thing can be so easily concealed, he explained. The woman has only to avoid being impregnated and it is all safe. And of the white Mobile woman who apparently conceived a child with a black man on her wedding morning, the black narrator told Redpath that was not the first time, but she had taken no precautions on that occasion. Of course, contraceptive measures did not always succeed, and in such cases, a wealthier woman confronted the same choices as a poorer one in her attempts to protect herself, her family's honor, and perhaps her black partner. During Hinton's testimony, one of the commissioners prompted him, "But the consequences are terrible to the Negro if found out." When Hinton agreed, the commissioner asked, "What are the consequences to the woman if found out?" To which Hinton replied, "They generally brush it up. Like poorer transgressions, as well-to-do white women might resort to infanticide or try to send the child away." A black man told Hinton about a planter's daughter in Missouri who had given birth to a black child and refused to reveal the father's name until the man escaped to Kansas. "The child was reported to have died," Hinton said, "but the man believes it was killed." That scenario is supported by fugitive slave Harriet Jacobs, who added to her portrayal of a planter's planter's daughter bearing the child of a slave. In such cases, the infant is smothered or sent where it is never seen by any who know its history. If unmarried, a planter class white woman could also resort to marrying a white man, hoping that no one could tell the ancestry of her child. Perhaps this is what really came to pass in the episode Redpath told of the Mobile woman who had given birth to a black man's child 9 months after her wedding. A planter class patriarch whose daughter transgressed could also send the child into the slave quarters, an option unavailable to poorer white families. As Freedman J.W. Lindsay told the Wartime Commission, a colored child wouldn't be treated any better if from a white woman than one from a black woman by a white father. The exercise of racial domination by elite white women might also be mixed with romantic emotion, at least from the women. Lindsay also told the commission of cases where white women fall in love with their servants, though he did not mention whether the black men returned such sentiments. That testimony is also supported by earlier documents. An antebellum traveler to Virginia heard of an intense instance in which a planter's daughter, having fallen in love with one of her father's slaves, had actually seduced him. Later documents concur, for the descendants of such liaisons told stories about illicit love between black men and planter class white women. Millie Markham, born in North Carolina about 1855, told the story of her parents, a planter's daughter and a slave. Her mother, a white woman named Tempe James, lived on her father's big plantation on the Roanoke River and fell in love with Squire James, the family's black coachman. Tempe's parents raved, begged, and pleaded, the daughter recalled, until Tempe insisted, "You haven't given me Squire. He's all I want." Squire's master sold him. But according to the story, Tempe ran away, bought and freed the man, and changed his name to Squire Walden. Tempe then drank a cup of whiskey mixed with Squire's blood before she swore she had Negro blood in her, and the two were married. Tempe's James family disowned her, and the couple had 15 children. Indeed, Squire Walden is listed in the census of 1850 as a laborer along with his wife, Temperance, and 8 children. If the story is true, Tempe James had altered her racial identity in order to marry a black man. The census taker designated both Squire and Temperance as mulatto. Adora Rian Shaw told a similar tale about her grandparents. Her grandmother was a white woman married to a white man on a Mississippi plantation when she came to fall in love with her coach driver, a coal-black N-word man. According to the recollection, the driver comforted the white woman who often confided in him about her unhappy marriage. When the woman got pregnant, her white husband nearly went crazy with fury, and the baby was bound out for 21 years. That child was Rianshaw's father. Wartime testimony describing sex between black men and white women, white abolitionists thus reversed both gender and racial stereotypes by painting the white women as aggressive and the black men as reluctant. Although white men of the planter classes ruled in the slave South, white women of slaveholding families also commanded power over slaves, both female and male, as well as over free blacks. While those white women may have suffered from and lamented the abuses of the patriarchs who ruled their households, they generally did not challenge that authority. White men of the slaveholding and non-slaveholding yeomanry, and even those of the lower social ranks of Southern society, also shared a measure of this power by virtue of their membership in the racial category white. White women outside the planter classes could likewise draw upon that power, if not always successfully. Where a white woman, whether rich or poor, threatened to cry rape or tried to threaten or experimented with threatening, the black man must have responded with some combination of disdain, anger, and fear. In such scenarios, it is not difficult to see how the two parties could later arrive at different accounts of the sex that may have ensued. The very institution of racial slavery recast and distorted traditional Southern gender hierarchies by allowing some women, white and free, power over some men, black and especially enslaved. Stories of the reluctance and resistance that black men told to white abolitionists, even if crafted with white ears, and then magnified by the white men who retold the stories, could not have been fabricated out of imagination alone. Rather, the black men would have been drawing on dynamics they knew to exist between black men and white women in the slave South. It is revealing that stories about coercion were often set on record by abolitionists, not only Union men like Richard Hinton and James Redpath, but also the fugitive slave Harriet Jacobs. The details of such stories may have been enhanced for the sake of anti-slavery propaganda, yet abolitionists may also have been among the few to describe the reality of the coercion of black men for the public record. Never before the Civil War had the words of black men on the subject of sex with white women been set down in so sustained a manner. Although there is no way to know how common or uncommon were scenarios such as those the black men described to white Northerners, their voices, as recorded during the war years, uncover a consequence of Southern slave society that lurked as a possibility, regardless of how frequently it came to pass. Very fascinating. Very also the story here of Tempe. Tempe, yeah, is a fascinating story. Tempe and Squire, that could be a movie. Continuing here. Sex and politics during the war. Whether liaisons between black men and white women occurred less often or more often during the social upheaval of the Civil War is impossible to measure. Wartime conditions meant that fewer white fathers, husbands, and local officials were present to watch over their families and police their communities. At the same time, for both black and white Southerners on the home front, there were the most pressing concerns of food to eat, the destruction of property, and the fate of the Confederacy. Evidence indicates only that sexual liaisons between black men and white women did not cease in wartime. In Western North Carolina, in 1862, for example, a white man named Jesse Black assaulted his white wife, Tamsy, after discovering her liaison with a black man. The white man, not the unnamed black man, was on trial, and the county court pronounced him guilty of assault. The higher court subsequently ruled that because a husband was responsible for the acts of his wife, Jesse was permitted to use force to make Tamsy behave herself. In southern Alabama in 1865, the white Martha Smith was charged with adultery or fornication with one of her former slaves, Joe. Martha Smith, not Joe, was on trial, and witnesses testified that the two had been caught in bed together in Martha's room in the house where she boarded. But there is no evidence that Southern authorities tried to crack down on such home front liaisons just before and during the war. In late 18 North Carolina, for example, N.J. Stewart and Matilda Leonard, a free black man and a white woman, were indicted for fornication and adultery. In early 1865, a slave in Richmond, Virginia, was sentenced to 2 doses of 39 lashes for associating and cohabiting with his mistress, Delia Mack, a white woman. Liaisons between black men and white women also occurred away from the home front. For example, a white Northern soldier in Missouri recorded in his 1862 diary that there was some excitement this morning on account of the disappearance of one of the girls who worked in the factory. She had run away, it was said, with a Negro or mulatto. The record is vague, but it seems that the man was caught and tied to a tree, then delivered to a man who had hired him, possibly a former slave master. The young woman came into camp a few days later, offering ill treatment from her father as her reason for running away as she did. She was subsequently left against her will at the house of a stranger. All right, jump into the comments. Going up to the comments, Easy Rollins says, "What up, bro?" Shout out to Easy Rollins out there. Yunu says, "What's up?" Shout out to Yunu as well. And yeah, I'm doing well. Just trying to blow through this chapter and then head on to sleep. So, although white Southerners lived in fear of slave uprisings during the war, white women were not necessarily engulfed by sexual alarm when white men went off to war and left them alone with slave men. In 1864, a white Virginia woman described 500 Negroes going throughout the county, robbing at every house they stopped and committing every crime that can be imagined, without any overt expression of panic about rape. Likewise, a white school teacher wrote in diary about a group of armed black men being mustered out of service 1865. If these corrupted Negroes are to be turned loose among us, she commented in a manner that can hardly be characterized as terrified, I do not know what will follow, but evidently no great amount of good. And a white Georgia woman expressed fear of black men outnumbering white men, but only in regard to insurrection. Even if fears of sexual violence could have been implied in such words as crime and insurrection, there is a considerable difference between such oblique references and the frenzied ravings of white women about black male sexuality that would so often be heard in the post-emancipation South. Wartime trials of slaves accused of rape of white women reveal, as in the antebellum years, masters invoking economic interests and putting forward technical arguments to protect their property, even in the face of, or likely more vehemently in the face of ongoing destruction of slavery. When a slave boy named Sam was accused of raping a 4-year-old white girl in Piedmont, North Carolina in 1864, the courts agreed that despite evidence of an emission of seed, Sam was innocent on the grounds that someone under age 14 cannot commit an assault with intent to commit a rape, thus indicating that concern for the master's property took precedence over any alarm at the alleged crime. Yet at the same time, there is evidence of harsher consequences for black men accused of raping white women during the war. Also in Piedmont, North Carolina in 1864, a slave man named Wellesley McDaniel was sentenced to death for the attempted rape of a white woman named Mary Boyd and subsequently pardoned. Unlike in antebellum pardons, however, this one came with the provision that the man receive 2 whippings of 39 lashes apiece, and wartime masters, like their antebellum counterparts, were not always successful in attempts to preserve their human chattel. In early 1865, when a slave named Elias was convicted of attempting to rape the white Martha Burton, his master sought a pardon, suggesting that he would put him in the army if the man were allowed to live. Elias was executed. Just taking a look real quick, see how many pages we got left. Okay, it's not that far. So I think it's only about 4 or 5 pages left. 4 or 5 pages. So we'll blow through this. See, we're on our way. We're on our way. Shout out to everybody watching this in the playback. So Elias was executed. Rape trials of black Civil War soldiers also reveal complexities in wartime white responses. Black women were most often the rape victims of white soldiers during the Civil War, whether the men were from the Union or Confederate armies. And most wartime rapes, no matter who the victim, must have gone unreported. As for crimes on record, although both black and white soldiers were tried and executed for rape during the war, the alleged victims were always white women. Moreover, black men were brought to trial and executed out of proportion to their numbers, indicating that white men more often got away with the crime. Nonetheless, when a black soldier was tried for the rape of a white woman, the court did not consider the man's guilt a foregone conclusion. Dangerous Brooks and John Shepard, for example, were part of a group of men from the 38th U.S. Colored Infantry who left camp near Richmond, Virginia, one night in 1865 and landed themselves in a courtroom on trial for rape. 4 men had returned to camp early, sensing what was to come, and one of them put it, I didn't go there for no sick purpose. I didn't go there for no sick purpose. I didn't want nothing like that at all. But along with 2 other soldiers, Brooks and Shepard broke into a house outside the city, and among the 4 of them, raped the white Mrs. Fanny Crawford and her 14-year-old niece, Eliza Woodson, according to fellow black soldiers. The men had boasted freely of their crime in conversation with the soldiers of their regiment. The dialogue that ensued between the court and these fellow soldiers, all of whom testified against Brooks and Shepard, was filled with colloquial language on both sides. One soldier quoted Brooks as saying that he fucked the young woman. Another heard Brooks say that he got some from the young gal. Here, the judge asked, did he say he He fucked the young gal, to which the witness replied, he didn't call out fuck. Likewise, at Shepard's trial, the court queried one of the witnesses as to whether either of the women tried to prevent him from fucking them. To another, the court asked, how many times did the prisoner say he fucked the woman? The woman used different words in her testimony, and the court followed suit in those dialogues. Eliza Woodson relayed that the men had done violence to her, and Fanny Crawford allowed that they had violated my person. The court rigorously questioned the accusers before arriving at a verdict. Lawyers asked Woodson why she had opened the door in the first place, whether she was dressed when the men knocked, whether a soldier had pulled her dress up, or had she done so herself, what she had done to prevent his putting you on the bed, whether she was screaming all the while, if she had resisted once on the bed, whether she had struggled as he entered, and exactly how she had struggled. When asked, what did he enter your person with, she answered, I should think you might know. Crawford was subjected to equally rigorous questioning, including, how did the prisoner force your legs apart when he used one hand to hold you down and the other held the pistol? Danbridge's Brooks' only defense was, I was not in the house, and John Shepard likewise stated, I was not at the house that night. Both men were hanged, just as in the antebellum South then, Black men accused of raping white women were more likely to be convicted and sentenced to death than white men accused of the same crime. At the same time, whites had not immediately assumed guilt when white women levied accusations of rape. The legal mutilation of Black men was also not unknown during the Civil War. In 1864, the doctors in Georgia's Cotton Belt carried out a sentence of castration on a slave convicted of the attempted rape of a white woman, and one newspaper commented that the action would rightly operate as a terrible warning. And in the wartime South, as in the antebellum South, it was not unknown for a Black man accused of raping a white woman to be lynched. Near Athens, Georgia in 1862, there was considerable excitement over the arrest of a slave accused of attempting to rape a white woman whose husband was away in the army. After the man's arrest, and despite pleas from various white authorities, a group of whites overpowered the sheriff and his deputy, took the man a mile out of town, and hanged him. A crowd of whites from surrounding communities sang and yelled as they followed the vigilantes. Still, two Athens newspapers denounced the lynching. One editor opined, is it not absurd then, while our noble army is in the field battling for law and order, that we at home should be trampling them underfoot? Wartime liaisons, rape trials, and infrequent lynchings all reveal points of continuity with the slave South. Boy, I'm tired. Okay. So wartime liaisons, rape trials, and infrequent lynchings all reveal points of continuity with the slave South. Black men might suffer harsh consequences, yet white women could also be blamed for liaisons across the color line, and Black men were not instantly assumed guilty by white authorities. At the same time, however, with the destruction of slavery and the seizing of freedom by African American men and women, the subject of sex between Black men and white women began to acquire new import and urgency among whites. During the Civil War, the issue directly entered into the arena of national politics in a concerted manner. Black men's hopes for and insistence on equality brought public expressions of fear from white Southerners. And those fears included direct references to white women and sex. White concerns over such transgressions now moved well beyond the realm of neighborhood consternation. Black men, both equated their experiences as Civil War soldiers with manhood, connoting the rights of citizenship and equality as well as autonomy. Former slave and acting chaplain Thomas Long sermonized to the men of his Black regiment that serving as soldiers kept freedom forever in their grasp. Showed our energy and our courage and our naturally manhood. Another former slave similarly assessed his experience as a soldier with these words: "This was the biggest thing that ever happened in my life. I felt like a man with a uniform on and a gun in my hand. Indeed, witnesses before the American Freedmen's Bureau, Injury Commission told of the equation not only between military experience and black manhood, but also between newly found freedom and manhood." George Ross, a head writer born a slave in Maryland, spoke on this point. "It is a pleasure to a man to work for his own living and pay his own way through the world," he said. A man. That is the idea exactly. Sympathetic white men concurred. General John Eaton, a superintendent of freedmen in Tennessee, told the commission how the arming of men who had once been enslaved promoted their manhood. And a superintendent of contrabands told how both military experience and independence allowed black men a sense of manliness. But white men of the Confederacy sounded alarm at these impending developments. In 1860, a Baptist minister contemplated the end of slavery and speculated on what would happen when every Negro in the South will be the equal to every one of you. As he told his fellow citizens, "If you are tame enough to submit, abolition preachers will be at hand to consummate the marriage of your daughters to black husbands." The subject of sex between black men and white women explicitly entered the arena of national politics during the Civil War and the presidential election campaign of 1864. It was the political moment that the Northern Democratic Party coined the pejorative term miscegenation, from the Latin miscere, to mix, in genus, race, and asserted that Lincoln's Republican Party advocated sex and marriage across the color line. Posing as Republicans, two Northern Democrats distributed an anonymous booklet advocating political and social equality, and specifically the mixture of blacks and whites. The authors wrote that although the frenzy of love in the white Southern woman for the Negro was rarely acted on, plantation mistresses had a stake in slavery because it permitted them sexual access to black men. Yet until racial prejudice was overcome, the authors maintained the full mystery of sex, the sweet, wild dream of a perfect love, can never be general. White women be entitled to black husbands. The Democratic posers also wrote about the desire of black men and white women, contending, our police courts give painful evidence that the passion of the colored race for the white party is often so uncontrollable as to overcome the terror of the law. Okay. So the publication was ignored or renounced by Republicans, and most readers viewed it with suspicion. But the fears of which its white Northerners authors played would be expressed with great seriousness by white Southerners, beginning in the Reconstruction era and continuing into the 20th century. With utmost solemnity, Democratic politicians brought the specter of sex between black men and white women into wartime congressional debates over racial inquiry. Over racial inquiry, whether discussing integrated transportation in schools or the advent of black suffrage. In an 1864 Senate exchange about the exclusion of blacks from railroad cars in Washington, D.C., one Maryland Democrat introduced the point that a white woman marrying a black man would provoke a trembling, anxious, depressing, harassing, crushing fear on the part of the woman's male family members. Less than a year after the war ended, a Democratic senator from Kennedy announced that any further empowerment of the Freedmen's Bureau would mean that black men could marry white women in violation of his state's laws. Another Southern senator promised that miscegenation would be encouraged if whites were cut off from positions in office and political power, and blacks were to become the ruling power of the country. Although this man did not specifically define miscegenation as sex between black men and white women, as opposed to black women and white men, he implied as much in his portrait of politically powerful black men. White Republicans joined in this dialogue about race, politics, and sex by pointing out the absurdity of conflating black suffrage with sex across the color line. A Pennsylvania Republican wondered in 1864 how any could believe that uh, how any could that marriage with a white woman would result because a black man countered by reminding white men of their own participation in such transgressions. The white man says he don't want to be placed on equality with the Negro, said North Carolina leader Abraham H. Galloway just after the war. Why, sir? He announced, and if you could only see him slipping around at night trying to get into Negro women's houses, you would be astonished. Thus did white Southern politicians begin during the Civil War to conflate the possibility of freedom and rights for black men with the fear of widespread sex between black men and white women. With emancipation and the end of the war, Southern whites who sought to maintain the racial hierarchy would begin systematically to invoke the idea that free and newly empowered black men would inevitably desire sex with white women. At first, Southern whites focused their fears largely on marriage and consensual liaisons. The threat of rape, um, the threat of rape, though present in some measures, is um, the threat of rape, though present in some measure in wartime and Reconstruction white rhetoric, would be much more blatantly emphasized and much more violently acted on in the last decade of the century. Interesting. Interesting. Last paragraphs here. Black men's stories of defiance, danger, and coercion recorded during the Civil War get no farther than the Government Commission. In the end, except for expounding upon the depravity of Southern white women, the American Freedmen's Bureau Inquiry Commission is definitely interesting. And thank you for sharing that. All right, so that's my mom, guys. Hold on. So, black men's stories of defiance, danger, and coercion recorded during the Civil War get no farther than the Government Commission. In the end, except for expounding upon the depravity of Southern white women, the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission kept the testimony it had heard about sex between black men and white women a secret from Congress and the public. Richard Hinton's testimony covered 32 pages, with the information about black men and white women occupying the last 6 of those pages. On the cover sheet, someone had penciled, "This paper can be printed as far as this mark X on page 27. The remaining portion should be suppressed." Wow. The X marked Hinton's disclosure about sex between sex between black men and white women. The AFIC's final report did not address the subject of sex between black men and white women. The commission had clearly judged it too controversial to let any readers believe that emancipation would bring sex between black men and white women in its wake, especially if such liaisons could not be written off as the province of the poorer classes of white women. In the Civil War, Southern dialogue on sex between black men and white women moved beyond the realm of language, crossing and into an area. Okay. In the Civil War, Southern dialogue on sex between black men and white women moved beyond the realm of village crossroads and into the arena of sectional and national politics. White Southerners now began to alter their strategies in responding not only to such liaisons, but also to the idea of such liaisons. Under slavery, sex between black men and white women violated the rules of patriarchy and racial hierarchy, and yet had never overwhelming impoverished. And yet, under slavery, sex between black men and white women violated the rule of patriarchy and racial hierarchy, and yet had never overwhelmingly threatened either system. With the demise of slavery, however, evolving or devolving white ideas about the dangers of black male sexuality would also become intimately intertwined in the violent politics of the Reconstruction South. And so that's the end of chapter 6. Quite a long read. I'm tired as hell, so sorry if I was dozing off or repeating on sentences and stuff. It's late as hell, but we got it done, and we'll pick up on chapter 7 next time in our reading. And I believe we're almost done with the book because I think there's only 8 chapters and maybe an epilogue or something like that. But looking forward to catching you all next time. Y'all be easy out there. Peace.